Hello, and thank you for joining us at IMS 2020 Day 1 late session. I hope you're able to catch some of the fantastic talks earlier. More to come. My name is Caitlin Mahoney, and I'm Object Conservator at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. My team for this session includes Laura McClure, who will be facilitating the Q&A after each talk. Elizabeth Soriano is running the content, and Tessa Schultz is keeping an eye on the social media pages. Before we get to our excellent speakers, I'll cover some housekeeping. Please note, your microphones will be muted and your cameras are turned off during the presentation. We're recording all the talks to post to the IMS YouTube channel, so we want the highest quality audio possible. Also, we're currently live streaming on that channel. When you have a question, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. And if it's for a specific person, just include their name. We'll try to address as many questions as possible at the end of each presentation, but we also encourage you to bring the questions to the after parties. Use the Slack app, #Day1LateSession, or contact the presenters directly. You'll find their information on the IMS webpage. Our first speaker today is Warren Bennett from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. He will speak on internal struggles, a look at interior mounting solutions.
My name is Warren Bennett, and I'm an object conservation preparator, in other words, a Mountmaker, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of the International Mountmakers Forum for giving me this opportunity to speak today. This talk explores some unique mounting solutions that are hidden within the objects, often when no mount is apparent. These aren't the most complex mounts, but they're typical of the anomalies that Mountmakers must think through regularly. As internal mounts are concealed, their techniques are less likely to be revealed or shared, witnessed. It was difficult to choose which pieces to include, and the objects in this brief survey were chosen for their diverse mounting needs. I'd like to start with a pair of porcelain vases currently in storage in the Met's American wing. Their unusual artist, Joseph S. Potter, was a diplomat who only took up porcelain decorating in his 50s after visiting a Meissen porcelain manufactory. Born in Syracuse, New York in 1822, Potter started a daily newspaper in Albany at the age of 17. He had a long, successful career as a printer. His work included anti-slavery broadsides and political treatises. He entered politics in Massachusetts, where he had become the official state printer. In 1875, Potter was appointed by Ulysses S. Grant to be United States consul to Germany, and it was here that his porcelain decorating career began. The vases are entitled Old World and New World. They date from the late 1880s. Each vase contains 4 allegorical vignettes. The vignettes contain ornately painted figures and objects symbolically representing the various continents. They're painted from the viewpoint of a worldly American statesman from the late 19th century. One vase depicts Old World, Asia, Africa, and Europe. The other, New World, North America, South America, and Australia. The imagery is problematic and is among many such images under scrutiny as the Met works on more inclusive and decolonialized interpretations of the collection. I bring up these pieces here today only to talk about their mounts. Each vase is comprised of 3 stacking components in a lid. As you can see here, there's a stand, a thin collar, and a vessel that's turned over on its top. The underside of each stand was made with a circular indentation and a hole in the center. This is to accommodate a standing rod that runs through the hollow center of each piece. The pre-existing mounts consisted of a circular steel plate and threaded rod that fit into this feature. A padded washer and wing nut held the piece together from above. Conservator Wendy Walker requested that new mounts be made for these bases. The pre-existing mounts allowed for movement between the components. Wendy pointed out that such movement is inherent when both pieces of heavy porcelain are stacked together at their most narrow sections, and one side is convex. Interior dimensions of the adjoining pieces all varied. To further complicate matters, one vase would be resting on repairs. You can see those repairs in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. The new mount should hold all the elements firmly together without play between them. Yet tension must be soft enough not to damage any parts under pressure. This way the vases could remain safely assembled while being stored or handled. I decided to use the pre-existing threaded rod as an armature from which to build out upon. My idea was to maximize contact with the surface area inside the piece. A tight grip would disperse pressure and prohibit movement. To fit each dimension and keep the rod centered, I brazed together a series of telescoping brass tubes. The thinnest tube hugged the threaded rod, and the largest the interior of the stand. When there was a gap between sizes, I flattened thin wire in the rolling mill until 3 evenly spaced straps reached the right dimension to close the gap in tube sizes. The interior of each stand flared out at the top. Taking advantage of the slight asymmetry in the porcelain, an epoxy mold would be essential to securing the tube within the piece. The first mount keyed in with no problem. However, the second stand was assembled and fired in the kiln with the top element inverted. This called for a different approach. This opening quickly expanded into a larger cavity. Clean clay was used to block the undercuts that surrounded the mold, but with limited purchase, this mount required a tube that extended fully to the base to stabilize it. The thin scalloped collar also had to be stabilized with an epoxy mold. It was necessary to lift the collar in order to support it. After sanding and painting, this would be the only visible portion of the mount once assembled. And you can see here that the top element was attached in opposite directions. With the lower tubes in place, an upper tube was needed to hold the vessel firmly to the stand. 3 wide arms would radiate outward along the vase's interior contours to stabilize the upper portion. Their edges were rounded and padded by suede polyethylene. The upper tube fit snugly over the lower tube. Now, a small but very important detail to each mount was a 1/8 inch thick Zorbathane donut. This was used to adjust tension between the components by tightening or loosening the wing nut. Although each piece locks into place one specific way, I realized that future mount makers I'll never meet may someday have to contend with these mounts. Since no element was completely symmetrical, there's a lot of opportunity to settle for a close enough alignment. This will inevitably be followed by more and more alterations before the mount is just regarded as a terrible mount because it doesn't fit. In hopes of prolonging the success of this mount, I stamped registration marks wherever I could. They convey the corners and where the seam should line up on the scalloped collar, as well as which arm should point towards which labeled continents. As the vases now sit assembled, there's just enough attention on the mounts to prohibit movement, yet they're loose enough that if knocked with a sudden jolt, they'll correct themselves like a tight spring. The next piece I'd like to talk about is from the Met's Egyptian department. The statue of Nepapetre Metahotep II in Jubilee garment stands just over 8 feet 3 inches tall. It weighs 2,570 pounds and dates circa 2051 to 2000 BC. The statue is one of 22 of this type that lined a processional path through the forecourt of a mortuary temple. The base was inserted in the ground. The king wears a traditional short mantle of the pharaoh's 30-year Jubilee festival. In his fists were the now missing scepter and flail, probably made of metal. In 2015, the statue was moved from the permanent galleries to a temporary exhibition entitled Ancient Egypt Transformed, the Middle Kingdom. Now, Mount making at the Met typically falls between two shops. There's the brass shop for lighter objects that I'm a part of, and then the steel shop who handle objects of this size all the time. The brass shop will occasionally assist the steel shop when it comes to epoxy fills, paint outs, or finer elements. But the Met steel shop handles an array of non-stop impressive tasks. I was called to the galleries one day to look at some rods. To my surprise, two 10-inch long, half-inch diameter steel rods protruded from the gallery floor. Their angles weren't exactly straight up and down, and the steel shop would definitely be creating this mount. But I was just asked to help in making a template for them that would capture the angles. Once back at the shop, I told my manager, Fred Sager, that the task should be easy. The piece stood on its own weight. I was sure that the holes in the statue would be wide and forgiving. Maybe the rods were installed loosely in the statue as it was lowered into wet cement and the rods sagged as it cured. I can't recall his exact response, but it was pretty ominous. He had a much better sense of the reality and didn't share my optimism. With the sculpture suspended by forklift, I brought some rods and I checked the hole sizes. Oddly enough, the holes weren't much wider than the rods at all, so the angles would actually have to be close to exact. In his temporary display, Mentuhotep II would stand alone as a centerpiece in the show's entrance. A steel cage topped with a steel plate with new protruding rods would elevate him. Eventually, all the steel would be concealed by a painted wooden riser. The statue would appear to be standing effortlessly. And my task wasn't to make the steel mount or even the wooden riser, but just to hand off this template to the steel shop, who are really good and you don't want to mess up their work. The hard part would be determining the exact angle and direction in space that each rod tilted. Any straight rod protruding from a flat surface will have a point at which it's perpendicular to that flat surface. Once this point is found, it will reveal the exact direction that the rod is pointing. With the direction and angle both recorded, a template and jig will allow you to transfer those measurements to a new surface. I rotated two precision squares on either side of the rod until the profile of that rod was straight up and down at 90 degrees. The line on which the squares then sit should be perpendicular to the direction that that rod is tilted. The reading of the digital protractor at its highest number should confirm this direction. The digital protractor read that one rod was at 93.7 degrees and the other at 95.5. And I'll add here that depending on the severity of the tilt, it may be easier to use a thicker tool like a squared piece of wood to find that 90-degree flush angle of rod. After making entry points and bearings on an acetate template, I transferred the angles onto wooden blocks. For bushings, brass tubes with tabs were screwed to the angled wooden blocks. The real trick here was adjusting the bushings by gently nudging them with a second layer of wood and additional screws, which I could ever so slightly drive in or reverse to adjust the angle. Of course, they didn't have to be perfect, but a 1-degree difference radiating out at 10 inches becomes more than 1/8 inch off, so it's important to stay as accurate as possible. The acetate template was then transferred to plywood. Adding a structural element like plywood is necessary in holding the jigs together, but it obscured the tilted entry points by the thickness of that material. To account for this, I first set up the template and jigs on the underside of the plywood and drilled at reversed angles. I then flipped the board and inserted the rods to help aid in retrofitting the jig's position. A test jig was made to confirm that the template would reproduce the correct angles. It consisted of an additional plane of wood that floated just below the tips of the rods. The rods would protrude through slightly oversized holes. This displayed the location of the entry and exit points of both rods. By placing this box over the original rods on the gallery floor, I could test the accuracy of those made by the template, and I adjusted the bushings until the rods protruded through the holes with consistent results. This is a mock-up I made in my kitchen to describe it. I handed off the jig and template to the steel shop to test the angles. The next day, the forklift lowered the statue onto the steel mount. The hanging statue had to be tilted to match its standing angle in order to receive the rods. A little sandstone dust fell from the holes as it lowered. I didn't relax until the Mentuhotep II statue sat flat on its mount. In the years since, I've occasionally pondered other ways to arrive at this same outcome. And the digital protractor has proven to be an incredible tool. For $15, it's invaluable, and it still gets a lot of use. The last mount I'll share is one designed by my coworker, Matthew Cumby, for the Asian art department. We've repeated this solution again as it's worked so well. The objective of the mount was to take the weight off the limbs of this earthenware Tang Dynasty horse, which dates from the 7th to 8th century. Because of the size, quality of craftsmanship, and ornate trappings, the horse was probably part of the tomb furniture of a high official or member of the aristocracy. The unglazed polychrome horse straddles a 1-inch thick plexiglass wall that lifts it off the ground. In order to create the illusion that the horse is standing rather than floating, its hooves would be suspended at an undetectable 1/8 inch off the deck. Although the plexiglass wall below the horse is visible, what takes place within the sculpture's hollowed underside is more complex. Slices of wood were cut to match the inner contours across the horse's back, dispersing the weight. The wood pieces were fastened together, resembling a wooden loaf of bread. The wood was then sealed and covered by a 1/8 inch layer of neoprene, and the wood loaf was then fastened onto a thick sheet of brass. Removable tabs were attached to secure the mount into the horse. A second brass component would anchor onto the plexiglass wall. It consisted of a lower plate reflecting the shape of the plate above. On the underside of this plate was a trough that hugged the acrylic wall. Bolts secured the wall through the trough. Now, one brass plate was locked into the horse and the other locked onto the plexiglass wall. The interesting part of this mount was the technique used to safely adjust each leg of the horse to the desired distance off the deck. The two plates of brass were lined up. 4 1/4 inch screws were tapped, one at each corner, so one screw nearest each leg. The space between the plates was adjusted by screw length. This way, each leg of the horse can be slightly lifted and lowered, similar to a very rigid marionette puppet. In order for this technique to work, the lower plate is drilled with oversized holes. The 4 screws are inserted through the spacious holes. Nuts were then soldered onto the screws while loose within the plate. These nuts were fashioned from segments of brass rod and then rounded on the bottoms. This rounded nut acts as a stop. It also allows the screw to tilt in any direction so it can align with the changing angles of the threads above as that plate tilts. Additional nuts were soldered to the upper plate for more threads to share the weight of the object, and these were countersunk into the wood above. Many visitors view the Tang horse in the Met's Great Hall balcony, not realizing that it's actually floating. While each of these mounts exist inside the objects, this is actually where their similarities end. Each object presents its own curveball that needs to be worked out. And aside from exhibiting such mounts in a talk like this, they'll exist in shadow, hidden from view. Thank you again to the organizers of the International Mountmakers Forum, and I'd also like to thank my coworkers for their ideas, support, and encouragement. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Warren. You overcome some real challenges in that talk, and I'm sure we are going to have some questions for you. So Laura will now lead us into Q&A.
Hello. Warren, we have a question. Is the Sorbothane archival?
I don't know that it is, but it's not contacting any art.
Mm-hmm.
I've never used it in contact with art. It's just between 2 parts of brass. So that is a good question. I don't know.
Okay. You mentioned that you were using epoxy. Are you using epoxy sculpt?
It's a Magic sculpt.
Magic.
Yes,
Okay.
with a barrier of acetate or whatever between to keep from bonding to, keeping everything clean, the artwork and the epoxy separate.
And then we have a question. How did you attach the mount into the horse figure?
The mount just fits up into it. And then when the two tabs on either side, on each corner fit in, there are undercuts that sort of lock it into place so they can't be removed. And then, so then that plate is then just set with the other plate and screwed together. So it's quite secure and stable. Just a snug fit, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And then I had a question for you myself, which is, what has been your favorite object that you've made a mount for at the Met?
I think it would be I took part in mounting, but it was Red Cloud's coat was a very memorable piece. I mean, working at the Met, we see all kinds of objects, so it's hard to choose, but that was one that really stuck out as sort of touching, I guess, and it's strange because I felt like I shouldn't have anything to do with it. I don't know. It was just surreal, I guess.
Yeah. We have, some more questions have come up. Do you usually sketch your mounting ideas by drawing, or do you use apps or computer programs as a tool?
We pretty much have always sketched. It's sort of a fun thing to do in our shop. But half of us now are learning, what is it? Fusion 360 or something. And I am not, but someday I probably will. Yeah, it's just sort of one of the fun aspects of the job, I think, is sketching them out first. And then you can draw the artwork as well.
That's right. We've got a question about your wood bread loaf. It was the idea, is it similar to a contour tool?
Yes, exactly. And that you do one and then the next, I used paper. My mount was modeled after Matthew Cumbie, my coworker, who's wonderful. But each section I would do a paper first, about 1 inch apart, and see what those shapes would be. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of hand talking. And that way you could sort of get a better feel for when it plugs in or not, and it comes in and out.
Right, and you can adjust the paper much easier because it's
You cut it out then. Yeah, account for the thickness on each side as well.
Oh,
But
right.
it's like a great way to to get the most out of all of that area, if it's about a foot or 14 inches or so.
Oh, that's how big that loaf was? It was like 14 inches?
This is all a while back. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. We have another question. How many members in your team? Is it a solo profession or is it teamwork?
There are 5 of us full time, and it goes up to about 8, I think. Mounts are usually done by one person each time, if that makes sense. And in the case of the horse, like I said, I was following someone else's, my coworker's example, who had made a wonderful mount that came up with that design. So yeah, we bounce ideas off each other all the time, though, and learn a lot that way.
That's really nice to have that.
It's the benefit of a large institution, I guess.
Yes. We just have another question that popped up about the Sorbothane archival. In this case, the object is terracotta and unlikely to react with anything, correct? That's correct.
Porcelain. Yeah, it's a porcelain in storage. Yeah.
Mhm. And then I had a question about the, porcelain. Someone said porcelain is even more stable. Yes, thank you for that. You meant tell me more about that, the Egyptian sculpture. You said it was 8 feet tall.
Yes. I am always thinking of other ways to try to figure out how to do that, and I always fall short. If anyone has any ideas, you know, I don't know if there's a commonplace rule that everyone does somewhere, but
I don't think there is a
it's
rule.
tricky to just figure out rods in space and direction.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
It was a real team effort, of course, because you had riggers in the steel shop
right.
and brass.
And do you have in-house riggers?
Oh, yeah, yes. There's a whole shop. You know, I think there's at least 5, but I think there have been more, possibly. Yeah,
Oh.
it's, you know, I don't know if it's like 2,300 employees or something. So it's sort of like a village.
It takes a village. That's what they say. Vincent had a question in the chat, which was, could you have epoxied the rods up into the piece?
Not, I guess, not, because it wouldn't be reversible, if I'm understanding correctly. Right? Like,
Vincent, if you want to type more onto that question in the chat, we can address that.
they also, I recommended that they make the steel rods not as tall as they were in the Egyptian piece, because I didn't understand why it would need to be, I don't know, I think it was at least 10 inches. I think it was 10 inches. And, you know, I don't know that it would need to be when it's so heavy and has a broad foot. How can you possibly, you know, if it's stopping it from skating, which is unlikely anyway, so. Yeah.
But
we have to be strong enough, I guess, to hold that.
Oh, right. We've got an interesting question, which is, what separates the line brass shop versus metal shop or a steel shop?
We balance that a lot ourselves. There's a typical rule of like 40 pounds or more if something's hanging on a wall. But oftentimes, if something's 150 pounds, if it's sitting on its weight or has a broad footprint or something, we'll often prop up one end of it or do something to help. But yeah, that's always up in the air, because sometimes we do things on the walls that are 55 pounds or something like that. And you know, it's always talked about. There's a reason for the decision one-on-one on an individual basis, I guess is what I mean.
Right. So Vince added into the chat, I have put sleeves up into work with reversible adhesive.
Oh, I don't know. Is that a B? I wonder what that would be. I don't know. That's a great solution, though.
They're going to have to get together with Vince and fly out to California, and you guys can eat avocados and talk about reversible adhesive sleeves.
And learn about earthquakes.
And earthquakes. And there's a question about earthquakes too that just came up, which is, would you work differently in an earthquake zone? So New York is not in an earthquake zone, are they?
Not yet. Yeah. I guess it would definitely be different, wouldn't it? I mean, it's a world we've only experienced by making mounts for courier trips, for locals, I should say. Yeah, it's a whole different world, I understand, especially from talking to Vincent about earthquake mounts.
Yes. And this relates to that too. There's a question, are there structural engineers involved with large objects?
Yes, but I don't know if there's any full-time at the Met right now. I know, that's not my area, but I've known of them in the past.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, 3 tons, 8 tons comes through that museum on the second floor sometimes. So there's definitely a lot of consideration there. It's obviously not my field because I'm working in a huge institution. Of course, there's a lot of I'm doing one specific task all the time, and I've worked in smaller institutions where I've had to do different tasks, like build the crates or the furniture for the museums and weight the crates, paint the walls. But here at the Met, there's such a you have one smaller division of labor is the word I'm looking for, I guess.
Right.
A lot of that. Yeah, so I'm not sure, but definitely someone's dealing with that.
BJ Farrar wanted to remind everyone that they should tune in tomorrow for our the earthquake mount presentations and discussions. Thanks, BJ. We'll be there. So in the same line of questioning, when do we call the riggers? Is it pounds per object or 50 feet, like something that's 50 feet in the air? When do you call in your riggers?
That is a great question. I think it's sort of subjectively when the art handlers don't feel comfortable with something. I don't know if there's a poundage rule. I guess it's subjective I don't know what the union art handling rules are, but it probably lies there. Sorry, I'm not more helpful with this.
You know a lot of things, and actually there is a question about a union, and the question is everyone in a union?
No, the shops are all union, as well as the art handlers, but Mountmakers are not. The steel shop is, however. It's kind of a...
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so carpentry, plexi shop, riggers, packers, carpenters. I don't know if I'm repeating myself. They're all union, as well as the...
We've got a question. What if they build a new building next door or tear one down? I wonder if that's about the vibrations, because you're in New York City, so everything is so close together. Would there be vibrations like an earthquake?
We've had, for construction in the Met, they have brought scientists and instruments to measure vibrations, while they were drilling in another part of the museum, to see just how it affects the cases. Yeah, definitely. Although, we are in Central Park, so we're a bit removed from any major construction, especially in that neighborhood. There's not a lot of those buildings are, I think, they're to stay for a while up there.
Oh,
they're very expensive. I don't know. Yeah, there, we have a lot of space around, but it is mostly about construction going on in the building. If they're going to drill into bedrock or something like that, there's a lot going into that. I know they've held up on finishing the Islamic wing until they finished the Greek and Roman wing below it, probably for this reason, because of construction.
Oh, right.
But I don't know, but it just seemed that way. They were happening at the same time.
We've got a question about the overview of how a work order progresses from idea to completion through the specialties, and who project manages the work.
I guess it comes from the individual department to conservation, which we're a part of. And then I think we work directly with the curators and collection managers, if that makes sense. We do keep track of everything with JIRA, if you know this system. how widespread that is. Yeah, it's pretty much a departmental basis, I guess.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
So, like a curator would have an idea for an exhibition, and then it kind of goes through the exhibition process of design, and then uh, like designing, and then everybody sits down and goes through the design plans, and then you talk about mounts and building cabinets and all that work. That's kind of how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I only know from our perspective.
Right.
You know, I remember in the British Museum, they talked about how the registrar department sort of broke up into an umbrella department that would oversee what's happening. Of probably messing this up pretty badly, of how to organize and break down what's getting made. But yeah, we just deal with the departments, I guess. There's like 18, maybe 17 curatorial departments at the Met.
Oh, wow.
Oh, there's an exhibitions group that they oversee this. Sorry. I hope they don't watch this. I totally forgot about them. They're pretty important. Yes, they exist.
They are real. They
Yeah.
exist. This is a great question that just came in. How many mounts do you fabricate in a year? And do you work like per exhibition? Like how many exhibitions do you do in a year? And then how many mounts do you do typically for each exhibition?
It's so broad, and a lot of times rotations, what they'll call a rotation and not an exhibition, will be more mount heavy than an exhibition. So if you have like 160 mounts for an exhibition, no rotation should ever have that many, but sometimes there's only a few, maybe 8 mounts. We make a lot of mounts all the time, though. It's rare that we have like an extravagant mount, or that we even document mounts like that. The Egyptian template thing, I just sort of made that during quarantine because it was 5 years ago, and there's details like, oh, I guess I over drilled in the template for them to tack for the welding, that I don't have a photo. I don't remember if it was sort of, it's a lot of that. We're sort of like, as my boss Fred says, we're sort of like short order cooks, always, and I know you've said it's the same in your museum.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking of it.
Yeah, there's not a lot of time for much. The sketches are even unusual that you would draw it like that.
Yes.
Unless it's just a convenient
outgoing loans or incoming loans.
Yes.
So we've got another question. I think we've got time for this one last question, which is, when an object comes off of an exhibit, do you keep the mounts, and do you have a system for tracking those mounts?
We do. They've started using TMS in each department, and we don't have storerooms in conservation. So each department stores the mounts alongside of the pieces, and I think they have a location in TMS as well. It's very rare that they get lost, but it does happen that we say, well, I made one 2 years ago. I know this piece. But we typically keep mounts, though, it's rare that something's displayed the exact same way it was last time. It's often that they'll tilt it at 90 degrees or 30 instead of 60 or something.
Yeah, we talked about that with Tim in our tour of his shop, which was amazing. And right, it's the same thing, is that you may be exhibiting the same object, but it will be displayed slightly differently. And so sometimes you can cannibalize parts, but
then you've lost that mount for the rest of that duration.
Right. Okay, I think that, oh, yep. That's it.
Hopping back on, this was such a great conversation to listen to, and more, and I'm still I'm going to be thinking of that Egyptian sculpture high stakes moment. I'm so glad it worked out successfully. It seems like you found a fantastic solution.
Thank you, Caitlin.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll catch you in the after party. All right. Our next speaker is Jill Comer from the Harvard Art Museums in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she's presenting today on invisible mounts, internal mounting techniques at the Harvard Art Museum.
Today I'm going to give a short talk about internal mounts. Mounts that you don't see when you're in a museum, but that are still keeping the objects safe and secure. Over 10 years ago, the Harvard Art Museums embarked on a renovation and expansion project designed by Renzo Piano. We reopened in 2014 with a space that embraced a more open and accessible display of artwork. Many objects that had been covered by vitrines in the past, which precipitated the need for a casework, one that would allow access inside the pedestal for the safe mounting of these objects. Here's an example of an accessible pedestal. One side serves as a door, much like a kitchen cabinet, and it can be secured shut once the installation is complete. This new access has allowed for a redesign of mounts in several instances. With internal access to a pedestal, a new mount can be designed that can be fitted and secured to the inside of the artwork and then bolted through the deck of the pedestal. In the past, these sculptures would have had basic tab mounts that noticeably secured the objects in place. Of course, we still do this in instances where there's no way to mount an object from within it, or in this particular case, the sculpture is on a cylindrical pedestal with no access inside. Sculptures with inner cavities, modern bronzes in particular, are good candidates for internal mounts. In fact, all the examples I'm going to show you will be modern bronzes. The space inside the object, as well as its size and structure, dictate how an internal mount will engage with the object. These mounts generally use multiple parts that either screw together, expand using nuts and bolts like a turnbuckle, or in some other way engage with each other to fit into an object. Undercuts on the inside of objects are highly desirable, allowing for an easy grip to be had once a mount is tightened into place from within. Warning, these mounts are not pretty. The words plain, clumsy, and ugly can be used to describe them. I'm going to show you 7 examples. But first, I will share some social media from the museum to prove that I can make an adequate regular mount. Okay, let's look at these mounts. This is a small bronze by an unknown artist titled Aeolus and the Winds. You will see that the base of the sculpture tapers in, creating a nice undercut. A mount that expands within this space will work well, with no need to worry about the rest of the interior space. Here's the mount in 2 parts. It has been sealed with B72 and acrylic resin dissolved in acetone and padded with felt where it will touch the base of the sculpture. The larger part of the mount has 2 threaded rods brazed on for bolting into the top of the pedestal. In this photo, the mount is upside down. The part at right also has threaded rods brazed on, but the rods are not attached to the tubes on the other side. They are separate parts. By tightening the nuts toward the brass tubes, the mount expands to fit snugly in the base. Here it is in the sculpture, before and after tightening. For installation, I always make a template beforehand. Take a piece of mat board, use a hole punch to make holes spaced the same as the bolts, fit the object on the mat board with the mount attached, and then trace the object. On installation day, mark where the object has been placed on the deck, replace it with the template, and make your marks for drilling. So here's the object, ready for installation. And here it is in the gallery, dwarfed by 2 large Dutch portraits, but nonetheless excitingly uncovered. Next is Kneeling Youth with a Shell by George Minute. This was a fun object to make a mount for. The negative space from the legs inside the base form the perfect area for an expanding mount. A similar mechanism is used for this mount as the last, except now only part of the mount expands. The threaded rod is brazed to the top brass strap and is again loose in the tube below. As the nut is tightened toward the tube, the brass straps flex outward, moving the silicone cushioned arms to tighten into the legs of the sculpture. Once the mount is secured, this object is ready to be bolted to the pedestal. And here is the Min with his friends in the Bush Reisinger Winter Garden. Next, we'll talk about the Barlock in the same gallery. This is the Avenger by Ernst Barlock. Now this mount might win the prize for most stupid looking, but it is also really simple and effective. Here is a view of the base of the sculpture. This base will allow for a very simple two-part mount, thanks in part to the little connection between the two openings. First, a polyethylene base plate for the foot of the sculpture is screwed to the pedestal top. A hole has been drilled in it and the pedestal to receive the second part of the mount. The second part of the mount is a threaded brass hook, padded with heat shrink tubing, which secures the sculpture down to the pedestal, bolting it through the pre-drilled hole. The sculpture looks great with uninterrupted lines, as it was meant to be seen. Next is Grand Arabesque, Third Time by Degas. This sculpture needs a mount to support a long angled leg and has limited space at the base, with a very shallow footprint. Consisting of 3 parts, this mount inserts into the leg of the sculpture with the 2 arms at the middle, stopping at the base, and a third part which slips up and locks all the pieces into place. You'll see here that this arm is brazed to the long stem of the mount, and this arm is brazed to a nut, which can turn on the threaded rod. This series of images illustrates how to fit the mount into the sculpture. First, the mount slips into the leg at the correct angle. Then the arms are fished into place in the recess from the foot, and then opened to fill the space. Finally, the third piece slips down onto the rod and bolts into place between the arms to stabilize the mount. This mount is now locked into place with no rotation possible, allowing for an intimate and dynamic display in our wartime gallery. This next sculpture is Perseus slaying Medusa by Giovanni Battista Foggini. But first, a tangent. You'll notice that there is still investment inside this object, left over from the casting process. Investment is a mold-making material used in bronze casting. Sometimes this mixture of plaster and silica sand hasn't been fully cleaned out of the inside of a sculpture. These areas should be avoided as much as possible for both a good mount fit and so as not to disturb the condition of the object. When designing this mount, a big consideration was the convoluted interior of this sculpture. It has a few smaller recesses that can be gripped, but only from different angles. A 2-part mount that screws together once each part is put in place will allow for secure mounting within this interior. The first part is placed into this curved groove, avoiding the investment left nearby. The second part fits into 2 adjacent cavities above and is aligned with the first part of the mount. Once the 2 parts are screwed together, this mount fits tightly and is Medusa as part of a display of Rococo and Neoclassicism in the 18th century. Next is Ile de France by Aristide Maillol, a larger example of a modern bronze. 2 views of this expanding mount show that one end engages with the space inside the toes on the right front foot, and the other end engages the left back foot. This slide shows this relationship more clearly. The mount is tightened into place with the object laying down. Once bolted to the platform, the object can be raised up and into place by hand. The platform is then secured to the gallery floor via wooden cleats underneath. And here's the sculpture on view in the wartime gallery, very near the Degas sculpture that we discussed earlier. My last example is Countess Matilda of Tuscany by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. The interior space of this sculpture is narrow and irregular, resulting in a more complicated 3-part mount. You'll see that these 2 parts connect by just 1 point, allowing them to pivot or rotate at that point. The 2 main mount parts are fished into the cavity while loosely engaged and adjusted until there is a good fit in the recesses. Then the nut is firmly tightened. Now that the arms of the mount are stable, the mounting bracket can be attached, providing the bolts for securing the object to the pedestal. Here is Matilda, installed on the west arcade of the museum, washed in natural light. I will quickly touch on alternative materials and techniques. While I'm using brass and steel rod in all of these mounts, in some instances, different materials can be utilized additionally. For a larger object, polyethylene, polyurethane board, or sealed poplar can work in tandem with brass to provide more structure to a mount. Also, we often use a two-part epoxy with brass parts, which would work great with some smaller or more complicated interior spaces. As we know in this line of work, often a mount can be made in more than one way. I look forward to seeing how other mount makers work with object interiors and what expanding mechanisms are used in other institutions. I'll end with saying that while it is always satisfying to make an elegant mount that safely secures an object without calling attention to itself, it is fun and refreshing to make one that seems clumsy, even ugly, but secures an object effectively and invisibly. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to discussing further in the Q&A.
Hi, Jill. Thank you so much. I completely disagree. I think your mounts were an amazingly elegant solution, and you are getting some love in the chat. I think Laura will come on and lead us in Q&A.
Hello again. Yes, we're getting lots of good questions in the Q&A, and I totally agree with everyone. Your mount is beautiful. How do you map the interior spaces to create the shapes which expand into them?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, each object is different, so you basically just get in there and start, feeling around. I don't know how to answer that one. I mean, you've seen from the photos, like they're pretty gnarly inside. And, when I was doing this presentation, I thought at the end, like, oh, I didn't show any epoxy work, and that's why I added it. But, sometimes these spaces are so narrow and you kind of don't want to put epoxy in there, so trial and error, I guess, is my answer.
And this is my question, are you using epoxy sculpt for your two-part epoxy?
We have like a PC marine epoxy.
Yes, in the little tube.
It's like Mighty Putty, you slice.
Yes, that stuff is great.
I've also used something called apoxy in the past, which is a two-part, and it's softer, so it's easier sometimes when you need like a softer epoxy.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Boop, 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 boop. How long did you spend on that mount for the Degas sculpture?
Actually, that's one of the ones that I didn't make. An old colleague of mine made it. I'm not sure, but something tells me it didn't take him too long. He was pretty fast.
What techniques, tips, if any, do you have for referencing and measuring sizes and angles, keeping the bronze with the investment being in mind?
Well, that object in particular had, like I said, had a few different like concavities that were pretty particular. And so that first part that I put in, it kind of just had this curved groove in it. And so that's where I started from. This is kind of like the first question. I mean, it's kind of like, someone earlier was talking about like carving ethafoam, and it is just sort of like, you carve a little here, carve a little there, fit it in, and, eventually you get it or you start over.
Right. It goes into the special filing cabinet called the trash can, and you start over again. Yes.
Exactly.
Question, why not thread brass elements rather than brazing to steel?
I mean, you could do that. I think one of the first ones, a mount like this that I did, I actually used like some stainless steel screws that I had, machine screws. And since you can braze it, why not? but also I used a lot of threaded rod. I mean, it's stronger. And then I didn't feel like cutting the thread and brass, so that's why I used it.
Have you ever used heated acrylic to make form-fitted elements which harden when cool?
I have not.
That's an acceptable answer. Do you install the interior mount in your studio, or do you usually do that in the installation space?
I would say probably most times you would install it in the sculpture when you're installing it. I mean, there are instances where an object will have an internal mount and then it's easier to have it in storage like that. One thing that we used to do before we had internal access to pedestals is we'd make these like wooden display blocks and have things bolted through those, and then those would get screwed so to the top of pedestals. So there have been times where we leave a sculpture on a block like that and then have that in storage like that.
This is a question that I'm not sure you should answer. I'll let you decide. Which is, how are the doors in the pedestals locked?
I mean, I feel like I gave some tips in the photo, but I don't know. There's like I don't know. I'm not going to answer it.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair. There are some secrets that should always be secrets. And there's a comment. It seems like an understanding of casting and negative space in the underside of the base is super important.
Wait, that's a comment, not a question.
It's a comment.
Right. I agree.
You can agree. That's great. Let's see. Oh, do all of your pedestals have doors? Were those made in-house?
They were not made in-house. Do all of our pedestals have doors? A great deal of them. A lot, but like I think most of the newer ones from when we renovated, we still sometimes use some older ones that we keep in storage.
Mm-hmm.
But that's sort of like the way we've gone. We used Gopion, so
Italian. And I had a question about your museum, which is, how many visitors do you typically get a year?
I don't know. We probably get a lot. We probably get a lot of tourists. I don't have that number. I don't know.
Okay. I was just curious. Here's a good question. Have you ever lost mount components inside the sculptures?
No, I don't think I have.
That's great.
I mean, I've definitely dropped things in the shop floor and had to scramble to look for them, but.
Do you store anything in those pedestals, like the design specs for your mounts?
No, not design specs. Trying to think of some. Well, we'll put like barcoded tags in there for the objects. Sometimes we'll keep like a housing for something. Rarely, but we might. But mostly it's just empty.
So you use barcoding to track your objects?
Yes.
Okay. As casts often have variation in material thickness in different areas, how do you assess which points were robust enough to take the pressure of the mounts?
I mean, all the bronzes I've made mounts for have been pretty hardy. Like I can't think of anything. The only thing I can think of is like, I don't know if you noticed, but with the George of the Minna sculpture, there were like little plaster, like there had been some conservation done, but I didn't need to have any kind of interaction with that part of the sculpture, so it didn't matter. I would say that these modern bronzes are very hardy, and I haven't had to worry about it.
This sort of relates to that, which is, do you weight the pedestals or do you use a floor attachment?
All the pedestals are screwed down to the floor.
Screwed down. If one of these sculptures go on loan, do you travel with the sculpture in order to install it?
It depends on the loan. We did in the last year have a sculpture that did have an internal mount and that went on loan like recently. I think I'm losing my train of thought. Just in the last like year or two, and a colleague of mine went with it. But we actually decided to keep that mount. It traveled with the mount attached to the inside so that it would stay in sync with everything. So yeah, I didn't go on that trip, but that mount stayed inside the object.
Mm-hmm. I don't, in my museum, I don't typically deal with a lot of brass sculptures, so I had never heard of investment.
Mhm.
And, you know, do you ever run across sculptures that it's like real crumbly inside? Like that would be terrifying.
That's how it is, because you set it on a table, you're working, you move it, and there's like little bits of sand.
Yeah. So what do you do? I mean, it's historic investment.
I mean, like I said, I made that mount a while back, so I don't recall a conversation with conservation, but I mean, I think that you're just going to lose a little bit of it with movement of the object, but
Yeah.
I would avoid an area that has a lot of it.
Yeah. And what is I don't know anything about sculpture. Is the casting material, is it plaster that's inside?
I did some foundry work in college, and I think there are a couple different ways of bronze casting, making the molds. But what we used was investment, and you would have a wax, and then you put plaster and sand, make a mixture, and cast that all around it.
Mm-hmm.
You put it in a kiln, the wax burns out, bring it back out, pour your metal in, molten metal. And rarely does it, I mean, I spent too much time on it maybe, but people had questions, so I added it in for a fun fact. But usually these sculptures are very clean.
That's great news. Question of what department are you based in?
I'm in the exhibitions department, exhibitions and production. I noticed some people are in conservation, and I find that fascinating. I'd love to know, like what the numbers are. Yeah. I'm also in a union.
Yes. Oh, you're also in a union.
I am.
How much time in advance do you need to plan to make mounts like these?
I mean, maybe it's not any different than other mounts, except that there might be more trial and error. Like, we try to do things, months in advance. And these were a group of mounts that we did, when they were redoing the museum. So we had hundreds of mounts to make, and they were just on a list. So
it's a lot of mounts.
Yeah.
Does the floor have inserts to screw the pedestals in, or the pedestals have permanent positioning on the floors?
Most of the pedestals have like a kind of a metal armature and with holes, and you can put screws into the floor. If it's like a taller, like we have like a big heavy bust or something, and it's on a very tall skinny pedestal, we'll actually like bolt that pedestal into the subfloor. And then like a situation like the Mayol that I mounted on the platform first, then I'd just like put wooden cleats, screw those onto the floor, and then you put the platform on top and screw from the sides, kind of thing.
Right. I think we have about 1 minute left. Which union applies to being a mount maker?
Well, I work at a university, and it's the Harvard Union of Clerical and Technical Workers. I mean, we have different grades, like our job titles, and like if you get to a certain height of grade, you're kind of out of the union. So I don't know how it works at other places, but.
All right. Well, we still have a little bit of time left. What kind of metal did you use in the mount?
And mostly all those mounts were made of brass and stainless steel. There were some parts that were like polyethylene or a little bit of wood here or there, but mostly brass.
Okay, I think that's it for questions.
I just saw that there was a question that asked if I was tenured. I am not tenured. I wish.
All right, if you have more questions for Jill, you're gonna have to find her at the after party today, or contact her directly. Jill, I just want to say, like, I appreciated that you showed us a whole series of these types of mounts so that we could really get a sense of how you create like this mount vocabulary for the inside spaces to help me think it through. Okay, our next presenter is Louise Bradley from Conservation Framing for Works of Art based in Rye, Victoria, Australia. And she's presenting two topics. First, mounting religious objects with a consideration for access to the object, and then mounting a private collection of ethnographic art. If you have any questions for this, wait until the end of the second presentation.
Hello, I'm Louise Bradley, presenting today my talk on mounting religious objects with consideration for access to the object. Welcome to Melbourne, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which I stand today, the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In this presentation, I will discuss two objects that were mounted for preservation with consideration for the need for access on religious holy days. Both objects were mounted in acrylic cradles inside timber frames glazed with UV filtering acrylic. The first object is a fragment of the coffin of an Australian saint, Mary MacKillop. The second is a Greek icon owned by an Australian family. First, I will discuss the coffin fragment of Saint Mary MacKillop, the first Australian saint, beatified in 1995 and canonized in 2010. She was the founder of the Order of the Sisters of St. Joseph, the first religious order to be founded by an Australian. She dedicated her life to the education of the poor and to care of neglected children, the aged and incurably ill. After her death, she was buried in North Sydney. People visited her grave and very often took away earth from around the grave, earth close to this woman who dedicated her life to compassionate care. For this reason, her body was exhumed in 1914 and her coffin was placed in a vault in the Mary MacKillop Memorial Chapel, also in North Sydney. In 1993, before her beatification, the vault was opened again to move the remains to a place beside the altar. Quoting funeral director John Harris, "Very early one morning in December 1993, I and several WN Bull staff members, together with two stonemasons, respectfully opened the tomb in which she had been placed in 1914. Once opened, the crypt revealed that the coffin had deteriorated considerably over the extended period of time during which she had lain there. The fragments of the old cedar coffin were carefully separated, and Mary MacKillop's remains, encased within the coffin's lining, were transferred to a new solid bronze casket to provide improved safety and security and to ensure their preservation. A ceremony was held in the afternoon, and a chapel packed with people witnessed the reinterment of Mary in the new memorial which had been constructed in preparation for her beatification. A Catholic parish connected to the Order of the Sisters of St. Joseph owned a fragment of this original coffin. The priest of the parish brought this fragment to me for mounting after a conservator had treated it. The priest requested a simple mount set in an elegant frame-like case. He also asked that the frame could be opened to bless or touch the fragment. The fragment would be stored horizontally with only occasional handling or vertical presentation. A cradle was made to hold the fragment securely. Pictured here is the fragment with the acrylic cradle before shaping beside the template to the right. It was shaped using an acrylic folding tool made by RH Conservation Engineering. Pictured here is my RH prototype bender. This is a wonderful piece of equipment to have, even if you only occasionally work with acrylic. It's relatively small at 31 by 31 by 12 centimeters and will bend acrylic up to 25 centimeters in width. The small dial in the center adjusts the heating time so you can bend from 2 mil to 8 mil thick acrylic. The acrylic's placed over the hot wire, and once the heat has reached the correct level, you can bend your acrylic up. Here's the acrylic folder in production on the RH Conservation website. In preparation for the framing, I sent samples of different shades of blue polyester fabrics to the priest, who chose a rich blue for the backing and lining of the frame. The back of the case was made of marine ply, sealed with 3 coats of varnish, allowed to off-gas, then covered with 4-ply rising museum ragboard wrapped with the blue fabric. The walls of the case were also made of marine ply, sealed with 3 coats of varnish, then faced with rising museum ragboard covered with the blue fabric. Small acrylic pegs hold the fragment securely in the cradle. The peg at the left was fixed in place. And I'm sorry I don't have detailed photos or really great drawings of these pegs. So here's some original, slightly rough plan drawings. The peg at the right was fitted with a 2 by 12 millimeter bolt countersunk into the acrylic cradle and up into the tapped peg. Here's the tapping bit with the 2 by 12 bolt. And of course the peg would be pre-drilled and then tapped. The right peg can be rotated if it's necessary to remove the coffin fragment. Here's an image of the object in the cradle showing the fitting bolts underneath the fragment countersunk into the acrylic. The cradle was fitted to the backing before the object was fitted. The cradle is held onto the frame back using 2 by 12 millimeter bolts countersunk into the acrylic cradle and passed through holes in the backing, secured with nuts on the exterior of the backing. The bolts were secured to the cradle with mylar and double-sided tape, archival double-sided tape, to facilitate the fitting. Here's a sketch of the frame profile and the cross-section showing the routed spaces for the mirror clip fittings at the back that can be removed for access to the mounted fragment. The glazing is 3 mil raw UV filtering acrylic. And here are 2 images of the final result, with the second image a more true reading of the blue fabric. Now to the mounting and framing of a Greek icon, mounted and framed for vertical display with a removable back so the family could touch the icon on holy days. The conservator who treated the icon recommended that the owner mount and frame the icon to help preserve it. The owner brought the icon to me for a mounting and framing solution. One major consideration for the icon was that it was so precious to the owner that he refused to leave it to me. So on his first visit, I took careful measurements of the icon and the owner took it home with him. Again, a cradle was needed to hold the icon. Note the extreme convex shape that would inform the design of the cradle. The cradle was made of acrylic with heat-bent sides to hold the edges of the icon. The bottom of the icon was supported and held in place with a curved shelf under the icon with a small tab that fitted over the bottom, front, center edge. The top of the icon was held with a narrow band with a tab that curved over the center front edge. I must mention here that after preparing the cradle and the frame, the client brought the icon back for fitting into the cradle and frame. Unfortunately, he again refused to leave it because it was so precious to him. He asked if he could wait while I fitted it. When I said that I needed several hours to do this, he agreed to leave and return in 4 hours. This was all a surprise, so there was a little pressure on the finishing of this job. There was enough play between the band and the fitting bolts that the icon could be secured in the cradle, then tightened in when fitting to the backing board. The contact area of the tab was padded with polyester felt. The cradle was held onto the backing using stainless steel pan Phillips head bolts secured to the verso. The backing was made of marine clay, sealed with 3 coats of varnish, allowed to off-gas, then covered with 4-ply rising museum ragboard wrapped with black polyester velvet. This is an image of the icon in the cradle with the cradle attached to the frame backing board, but not yet fitted into the frame. Again, the cross-section of the frame. The rebate was routed into the section. The frame was cut to size, 3 sides joined, the ROM UV filtering acrylic slid into the rebate, then the bottom fitted with screws. I routed space out of the back edge to accommodate mirror plates for fitting. The back can be removed by unscrewing the mirror plates. And the finished piece. While the icon can be removed, I doubt that the family will remove it now that it is safe and secure, and they can still touch the acrylic and the icon through the acrylic. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that you all stay safe and that your loved ones are safe during this unusual COVID time. Thank you. Look, good view. That's cute. They might do Q&A now, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Louise, we are going to have this next presentation and then do Q&A afterwards.
Okay, great. Thanks.
No problem.
Okay. Hi, I'm Louise Bradley, presenting Mounting, a private collection of ethnographic art. Welcome to Melbourne, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this forum. Before I begin, I would like to again acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In 2018, I mounted a collection of ethnographic objects from Australia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. It was the wish of the owner to display each object as simply and elegantly as possible, and to allow the owner to remove the pieces for occasional handling. The bases should be movable, so each piece could be displayed in different parts of the owner's home, or so that they could be displayed separately or grouped together. 2 small flat objects are displayed on simple acrylic stands: an Aboriginal pearl shell pubic plate and the Solomon Islands engraved shell ornament. The other objects that I will discuss today required other solutions. First, a Maprik figure from the Maprik region, East Sepik province of Papua New Guinea. From Lombok Island, a knife. Also from Lombok Island, a lime spatula with a man riding an animal. A lime spatula from the Matsim district, the extreme southeast tip of Papua New Guinea. And here's some details of this lovely object. That object was to be mounted with this next object, also from Papua New Guinea, a tool with bird ornament at top. From Lombok, an ornament from a knife or tool depicting a man with a bird above. A bull roarer decorated on both sides, and a second bull roarer. First, I'll describe the mounting of the Mountmaker figure. The owner of this lovely sculpture had it mounted previously, but was not pleased by a metal rod encircling the waist. He felt that it restricted the freedom of the object. Together, we arrived at a design for an acrylic mount so the figure floated above an acrylic base and would be held at the back using existing holes. These figures generally have long torsos and short legs and very short calves. For this reason, the figure was set at a height approximating the length of the missing legs, around 12 centimeters up from the base. Here are some images of the prototypes made to work out the structure for this mount, showing the chair-like shape needed to hold the body in place. With a flat plate at the top that would be shaped to fit the curve of the back of the sculpture, placed on a 30 by 30 by 3 centimeter thick base, all to be made in acrylic. I made a model of this proposed mount with the support roughly shaped to fit the contours of the legs of the sculpture. I commissioned a display fabricator to make the base, resulting in this lovely plan they made from my model. They made a fine mount, but they did not want to shape the central chair-like support structure. So I shaped it with a Dremel tool and polished the area with jeweler's rouge to fit the sculpture contours. I shaped the back support to fit the curve of the back of the sculpture using a hot air gun, and the sculpture was set in place and fitted using 2 screws countersunk through the acrylic into existing holes in the back of the sculpture. Here's the result. Now the other smaller objects. It was a wish of the owner that the objects be mounted in a most minimal way so they could be easily placed around the home and also may be removed for handling. The decision was made to mount the objects on 3 by 15 by 15 centimeter acrylic blocks with 2 pairs of objects on 3 by 15 by 30 centimeter bases. Small holes would be carved into the acrylic to hold each object. I made sketches of the end of each object to plan out the carving of the base. The shapes were reverse carved into the acrylic using Dremel bits, then polished with jeweler's rouge. The objects stood on the mounts without need for other support. The Lombok tool ornament was mounted on an acrylic rod that took the place of the missing tool. The top of the acrylic rod was shaped to fit the space in the ornament. This solution, with objects freely standing with minimal support, may not suit the needs of all collections, but for this private collector, it was the ideal solution. Thank you kindly for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Louise. I know we're going to have some questions after this 2 great talks, so I will leave it to Laura to come on and lead the Q&A.
Hello. Yes, we've got some questions coming in. So the first question is, how might you adapt the mounting strategies for the saint's coffin fragment and the icon for a publicly accessible exhibition? And a little added to that is, one of my upcoming exhibitions will include actively venerated pieces. Accessibility for worship is key, as is security.
So how to adapt those existing pieces for public display?
Yes, for a publicly accessible exhibition.
I mean, you could either display them as they are in those cases or in the small frames, or remove the frame, and I would probably put it in a display case though. I mean, to prevent the public from touching it, even though the owner might touch it. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. So it needs to be in a case, but those could be used in a case very easily, those displays.
Yes.
Yes.
And you could either, with a coffin fragment, you could display it horizontally or vertically.
Mm-hmm.
But the icon, obviously, you would want to have vertical, I would say.
For the coffin fragment, how was the acrylic cut to shape?
I was at that point a bit old school, and I used a fine jigsaw blade for acrylic.
Mm-hmm.
And then basically hand finished it and polished with jeweler's rouge on it. Yeah.
When you polish your acrylic, do you use a Dremel tool or use a buffing wheel?
Buffing wheel, yeah.
Buffing wheel.
And you could use, with the small sculptures on the bases with the reverse carving, I used a very fine Dremel polishing tool with the rouge on it. And sorry, I didn't have a very good image of the final result. The sort of three-pronged hole was in progress.
And a follow-up to the contour shape. How did you get the contour shape of the object to begin with?
The icon or the Mountmaker figure?
I think either one. Or both.
Well, with the icon, I believe I traced it. And then I prepared the cradle because it was a simple semicircle, I prepared it to shape with the measurement of the depth of the icon and the tab at the edge, because it had to be ready for when the owner came, because he wouldn't leave it for more than a couple of hours.
Right.
For the Mountmaker figure, because I had that, I was able to, well, with the foam core, I could carve it until I thought it fitted. And I assumed that the fabricator could do that for me. But when they said no, I had to do it. And it was a matter of trying to copy the foam core model and then fitting the figure on. And once it fit fairly well, then I started to polish and refine from there.
Question: do you seek approval from conservators' collections teams to fix mounts into existing holes in objects? And how common is that in practice?
I believe it's fairly common. I think in the museum world, the approach would be to not secure something, or definitely not to add a hole, and ideally maybe not even use an existing hole if you could use acrylic or a metal band to hold something. But this collector said that he would rather nothing hold that little figure. And he said, just put some holes in it. And I explained that ethically I couldn't do that, but I could use existing holes. And he also said, well, could you please use brass screws, which was interesting. Yeah. Yeah. He was very, very particular. And he's probably one of the one of the most interesting, important, and caring figures in the art world, who's become a little bit reclusive, but he has a great deal of knowledge about art and objects.
Are you concerned about the tips of the small ethnographic objects breaking or being damaged while on display with no other support?
Yeah, that's a good point. There is a concern, but again, this collector he's almost a museum, sort of a museum practice informed person. And I imagine he would be extraordinarily careful. Another issue, which is why they aren't secured in any permanent way, is that there's a risk of bushfire. So every year he moves these objects out well before the bushfire season and has them in another location and then moves them back again. So they need to be movable, and he would remove them from that support and take off with them. Yeah.
I would never think that you have to move your collection because of bushfires, but that's because I live not in a place with bushfires.
Well, an interesting issue there is that a lot of people might have to flee very, very quickly and leave everything behind and hope that things survive. But in this case, this person knows what he will remove well before any danger. And also he removes himself, obviously, well before danger. But yeah, he's very well informed and understands the importance of being an owner.
The next question is, when securing the first figure from the ethnographic collection, why did you use screws instead of acrylic rods?
The owner requested screws, and it's possible that it was because he wanted to be able to pack it up in the bushfire season. And acrylic rods would mean that he had to take the piece on the mount. And from memory, I think with these objects, he would rather be able to pack the objects separately and move them, because he tends to do his own movement and, in a domestic vehicle. And rods would have been a good idea, but he also wanted to not have anything encircling the figure. I mean, I personally might have had an acrylic rod encircling, but he didn't want that.
Is there any question of objects or mounts being blessed during a ritual?
With the Mary MacKillop, I believe they do regularly bring it out. And I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, it was the 10th anniversary of her canonization. And unfortunately, I don't exactly know where this fragment is now, but I would imagine it would have been brought out and presented to the congregation and maybe blessed at that time. But I should say that with both of those, the icon and the fragment, I doubt that they'll remove the back of the frame. I mean, it's possible, but I think that might happen very, very rarely. But you did see with the icon, I think the family may have seen that it had deteriorated from some touching, and that once it was encased, they might see that as an ideal solution to preserving it for the next generation. And again, I don't know where that is or what happened to it. I'm sure it's extremely safe, but they didn't tell me where it would be located.
Right.
I mean, I'd like to see it again, but it was as if he was handling his kind of the soul of his whole existence. His whole family was in that piece. And the look of terror when I said, "Look, you will leave it with me." And he said, "Oh, no. absolutely not. So you just work around those concerns.
Right. We have a question from Vincent. Our museum is just beginning to consider our collection pieces in larger cultural context and is now beginning to take stock and re-examine displays. Has this been an ongoing practice for you, or has this come up in just a recent cultural shift?
In Australia, that has been in process for maybe even the last few decades.
Wow.
And yes, it is very important. And there's also a program to help to train and bring more Indigenous people into the treatment of their own objects. And Melbourne University has a big program. Normally, students need to have an undergraduate degree to enter the Master's Conservation Program. But in the Indigenous communities, the students can come in because they have such a great base of the cultural knowledge.
Right.
But it is a major, major importance. And I mean, I don't know if you know, there are objects in the Indigenous culture that women should not see, and probably vice versa. And when those treatments take place, they aim to find a male conservator who can do the treatment or obscure the areas of the object with the permission of the cultural owners. Get permission that a woman can treat the area that's not hidden. I mean, a small part of the object will be available for treatment at a time, but it's a major issue, and there have been some really good papers written on it. Yeah.
I had a question, which is, how did you get started working with acrylic?
I'm not really sure. I think it arose from the need to use something that was inert and also as minimal as possible. And also, when I began working with acrylic, that's, I was in contact with my friend Robin, who made that, the bending machine. But it's also something that if you're making small supports, you can also do it or work it with really old school methods of hot air guns, jigsaws, even hand cutting when necessary. But when you want something really, those very dense, thick supports, I'd rather leave that to a fabricator. And if I've ever used or had really large cases for display, when you need bevel cut edges with heat polishing, I'd rather a fabricator do that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what is the tool that you cannot live without when you're working with acrylic?
Oh boy. I suppose the polishing is extremely important, but one fantastic tool for if you work as a framer, and a lot of framers won't use UV acrylic or acrylic because they need to order one sheet cut to size. Those Olfa hand cutting tools are unbelievable. And you buy one and it will work, 20, 30 years later, it's good as new. And you can easily zip pieces to size or even cut little bands, file them back, polish them. Yeah, the Olfa cutting tool, but Olfa in general makes such great hand tools.
Yes. And so you mean like a cutting tool or like a rotary cutter?
It's score and snap. So it looks like it's probably about 2.5 to 3 centimeters long with a little hook on the end.
Oh.
Extremely sharp. Sorry, I don't have it with me.
I know, I was just looking for my blade, but I don't think I have it. I have my rotary cutter here, which is, but
down in drawer 3 in a little box, a yellow handle.
Yeah, I don't have mine.
kind of looks like that, but a little more
Oh,
with a yellow handle.
oh, and
But,
it has a hook on the end. That's very useful.
yeah, it is amazing. And also you can open up the handle and there's a spare blade inside, but with that beautiful Japanese steel, the one blade would probably last you 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, if you're a small shop or a small museum and you don't have a big team, it's really great for cutting quickly in an emergency. Yeah.
Cool. I'm getting.
Yeah, I would say that I've rediscovered the joys of Japanese tools, and I bought some exquisite clamps, brass clamps, really teeny ones, and Japanese awls are very beautiful to use. Yeah, I would.
I'll be looking into it.
Here it is.
I
My
didn't want
trusty
to interrupt.
assistant.
You have the tool? Oh, brilliant.
That's it.
So there's your OLFA. I can put a link up to it. Oh, put the blade into my jumper.
That's great.
And you can open up that side, and that's where you'll find the your spare blade.
That's
You know, I'll bet you can find them on eBay because most art shops won't stock these.
I think we'll have to continue the tool talk in an after party session. I'm sure there'll be a whole room that would love to hear more about these Japanese tools. Thank you so much, Louise, for your interesting presentations. It certainly created a lot of discussion in the chat. That wraps up our first day of presentations for the IMF 2020. We're so happy to be able to reach out across the globe, even in this strange time, to talk about mount making. Our after party begins at 7, which is not recorded. I underline that. So you can let your hair down, ask those questions that you didn't get to ask earlier today. And if you're not registered, you can do so at mountmakersforum.net. Hope to see you there and talk in a more informal setting. Thank you all so much.